Alright, now that I just did the video on Hitchcock's Rebecca, I figure we can go into the remake that just came out on Netflix this past weekend. And it's brought to us by Ben Wheatley, who has a very interesting and sometimes dark filmography, and it sort of has like this kind of wicked sense of humor in it in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's just like flat out bleakness and crazy, but so obviously that made him kind of an interesting choice for this, which kind of made me interested past the whole thing of I've said so many times that I'm not anti-remake. There are some of those cases where you hear a remake announced and you're like who are you making this for? Like who is it that's going to be drawn to this exactly? Like what audience? But in cases like where there's already a beloved source material in Daphne du Maurier's book, it's there can be ways to do that to where there doesn't necessarily have to be a definitive film version, where if it's not exactly like that, then it doesn't matter. So like you can have different interpretations of a book that may be like the same story and the same beats, but maybe nothing like another adaptation of it. And there's obviously been a number of adaptations of it already. From like there's a mini series, and I want to say there's like a TV movie or something, um, and a number of ways. But obviously, when I immediately just think of Hitchcock's version, like to the point that my first concern was see because I hadn't seen any of those other adaptations, only Hitchcock's, and it was like trying to imagine Rebecca in color was gonna be weird because like even reading the book this past summer, when it would get to parts where color was prominent, like when she first gets there and she talks about how like the rhododendrons are so red they're like startling, and it's like it was kind of jarring imagining this world in not just color but in a very sort of bright kind of atmosphere like that, like so bright that it's confronting. But with a skilled enough director, you can totally probably pull that off. But there's a number of things going into this that are that I'm not quite sure about. Starting with our two main cast members being Lily James doing Mrs. De Winter and Armie Hammer as Max, which I do really like Armie Hammer, and he's reteaming here with Ben Wheatley because they did Free Fire together, and Free Fire is my second favorite Armie Hammer performance after The Social Network. I love him in Free Fire so much, so it's like reuniting with Wheatley was like that's a very good start. It's a very very different part, so that was concerning, and those concerns pretty much came to light more as I was watching it because Armie Hammer's obviously like physically built for roles like this. Like he's got the very like he just looks rich and and charming. But as far as his acting abilities go, I think he's much more suited for stuff like what he was doing in Free Fire and stuff like that, like really wild supporting characters. And here where it's kind of like romantic lead meets like stoicism with a little bit of underlying darkness that's not near as evenly distributed here as it was in like Olivier's performance. Um, but that could be a number of problems. That could be a direction problem or a writing problem or whatever. But yeah, so I really like Hammer, but in these particular parts, I feel like there's not a whole lot that his his abilities lie elsewhere. So also with Lily James, she hasn't really and this is just more of a subjective thing. She just hasn't really made like much of an impression on me personally yet. Obviously, it's still very early in her career, so I could have like a full on turnaround. But for the time being, everything I've seen her in, like even in movies that I love, like Baby Driver, there's just nothing really stands out that I can think of, like the Cinderella remake that she was in. It's like I have to constantly remind myself that was her, wasn't it? Because she just doesn't. I guess she just doesn't register with me. So it was concerning seeing her given the very daunting task of being Mrs. De Winter, and I kind of still feel the same way. Like they try to seem to give her more to do. Like they kind of have, like Mrs. De Winter kind of seems a bit more in charge of herself in this, and she like takes matters into her own hands a little more. But I don't know. It just wasn't really like I'm still in the same place. Like I'm not really gonna register exactly like what she's done when I'm the next whatever the next thing is she's gonna be, and I'm trying to think now which one is Lily James again. Oh yeah, she was Mrs. De Winter and she was Cinderella, but I don't really remember anything about those performances. So that's unfortunate, but like I said, that could just be me. But yeah, so when you look at like the kind of opening here, we do have a brilliant casting choice with Ann Dowd being Mrs. Van Hopper, which is probably the best casting choice in the movie outside of Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers. But still, in this whole opening, there was a lot of stuff that kind of felt off, and I didn't go into this movie like Knives Out or anything, and like, well, it's a remake. This is probably and it's in color and it's gonna be jarring, because I'm so used to the way Hitchcock's looks and how it played out, and Olivier and Fontaine and Judith Anderson and George Sanders and all those people in those roles, and it felt like, and I hate saying this because it feels almost like condescending in a way, but it's like it's one of those cases where it feels like you're watching established actors, but they come off like students in a theater class, like people who are just really happy to be playing dress up and being in like locations and all that. And there really wasn't much of the underlying factor that should be here, especially when we talk about like I guess I don't know if I don't want to say like I guess intimacy between them, where we're watching them, and it does feel like when I talked about Hitchcock's movie, I talked about how it's like it almost felt like kind of a fairy tale moment when they found each other and they went through this whole thing and they played phone tag and all that. And it was almost like this. It was almost like a romantic comedy of sorts, just with these underlying factors every now and then where Max's darkness would kind of rear its head a little bit, and make him kind of mysterious. And with what's the way the opening scenes in this play out, like I said, just for starters, right away, like we brought up before, just the whole brightness of it is a little jarring. But I feel like that's not necessarily the movie's fault. That's just being so familiar with Hitchcock's. But the thing though is that it feels like as far as when I talk about the intimacy between them, where it's like before it kind of felt more like not taking necessarily the book into account, but just like Hitchcock's movie, it felt more like a companionship thing, as opposed to what we see like the PG-13 sex scenes on the beach that are in this movie or whatever. I mean, there is the line in both the book and in Hitchcock's movie where he talks about I'll make violent love to you under the palm tree or whatever, which felt like it kind of came from out of nowhere, in the others, but it was still like there was the implication of that, but something kind of feels off about like the coldness that comes later doesn't feel as like potent or lived in. Like it feels very kind of abrupt, but not in the desired way of the way it plays out, and it just kind of feels like it's one thing and then it's another, and just feels more like the tone is confused. Whereas like when you look at Hitchcock's movie, it's very seamless, because we kind of got the hints of it, and I mean the hints of it are here, but they're either too obvious or just not really hitting like not hitting that impact at all. Like it's almost like it's telling us like just kind of straight faced, hey, Max potentially has a dark past, and that's it. Like there's nothing we really like feel in regards to like the perspective of Mrs. De Winter seeing these little changes happen in him, but it's yeah, I don't know, it just kind of felt off overall. And then when they get to Manderley, there is some of the effect is done in by the editing being really jumpy. Like it's kind of like that when they're montaging through everything in the opening scenes. But then there is the first shot of Mrs. Danvers, which is not counting the opening scene where we get like flashes of shit. But the first time we see Mrs. Danvers when they arrive at Manderley is incredibly unceremonious. It is like anything but Judith Anderson gliding up to the camera. um, and it's and like I said, I don't want this to seem like I'm just comparing it to one adaptation, because there's not really a fairness there. But especially when you're adapting a specific source material, but still, it shows the shortcomings of the movie itself very clearly. Because the first shot we do get of Mrs. Danvers is like a fraction of a second, and it's her just kind of looking out the window while everything else is going on. And then we get the shot of her, like, the shot we expect. But it is interesting that when we saw Judith Anderson, there was like all the other people around her, and then she kind of came out of it. But it's like the first time we see Mrs. Danvers here when they go into the house, she's just by herself, which is also jarring in a good way. But as far as Kristen Scott Thomas goes, and this might sound like way overly picky and kind of a ridiculous criticism, but Kristen Scott Thomas as Mrs. Danvers is so perfect. I almost feel like it's one of those cases where the casting choice is so obvious. Like, it's a case of course, Kristen Scott Thomas would be cast as Mrs. Danvers in an updated Rebecca. But it's to the point that it's almost a boring choice. Like, it almost kind of makes you long for somebody that would be maybe a bit more out of the box, but could still do it to the greatest effect. But that's not to say anything terrible about what Kristen Scott Thomas here. It's just the trouble is that when you hear Kristen Scott Thomas is playing Mrs. Danvers, you just pretty much get what you think you're in for, and that's the extent of it. So, well, like I said, I know it's weird to basically criticize Kristen Scott Thomas for being reliable, but I was just I figured it would be more interesting if they went a bit more inspired with who they chose, but still, I mean, at least it's not a missed opportunity, I guess. So there's that. Um, but now, eventually, once they get here and everything gets settled in, we get the story beats we're expecting, like when she breaks the ornament and she hides it and stuff like that. It's just the way everything is almost feels a bit too, like, overly dramatic. Like in like, for instance, when we're talking about like when she kind of does start taking matters into her own hands, and it almost becomes like it's almost like she's in some detective story or something. Feels maybe a bit overdone, but then there's moments like when she breaks the ornament and she gets a cut on her hand when she tries to pick it up, and this is played so dramatically, like it's going to be such a big deal, even though we already know where the direction of that moment goes. They I don't know what it was they were trying to like really make overly dramatic. It was almost like I was getting this really bad feeling when we were getting scenes like when Max is sleepwalking or when she's like having nightmarish visions. And it's like I can get the purpose here, and I feel like if they were better executed, it would feel like it makes a lot more sense. But the way they're done here is so overdramatic that it feels like kind of a distrust in the material working by itself. Because as we've seen, if you just this is a story where just the way everything already is, just as is by itself, with not a lot of like really drastic flourishes, it'll be creepy by itself. As long as you can establish everything well and like just really mainly focus on like lighting. It could just do that in itself, but to go all out and do like the sleepwalking scenes just feel like an excuse to have characters walking around in the dark like you would in some generic horror movie. Um, and it's like the way we're having like the nightmare sequences and all the visions and stuff like that feels like it's it's just not letting the creep factor just kind of settle and be itself. It's like it has to scream at you when Mrs. De Winter's in like a particular place mentally, and all this is becoming extremely overwhelming. And it's like, and I can, like I said, I can back doing that in a more visual way, which what seems to be what they were going for. But this is like way, just like I've been saying, over dramatic, really, and over the top. But And what's weird about that also is the scores part in this, because I keep saying everything is a bit too overdramatic and everything seems a bit too overdone. It's weirdly complemented by a score that the score doesn't feel dramatic enough. The score feels like it's just kind of there, and I get there are many cases where an invisible score can be really effective if it's doing its job, but it's for most of it feels like practically non-existent, and for the fact that they seem to be going all in on every other aspect, that just seems weirdly like it doesn't match up. It's weird, and it was actually getting to a point to where I started losing faith in any sort of semblance of subtlety, because it was like by the time we had gotten like the nightmares and the visions and all that stuff, like the vines and all that stuff. There was a point in time where we see like a whole flock of birds in the sky, and I just kept saying to myself, "You better fucking not form an R. Don't don't." I was literally talking to the bird, saying, "Don't you fucking dare form an R in the sky, please," because we've already like kicked subtlety out the window. Do we really need to go any further? Thankfully, they didn't. So there's that at least. But the fact that I had to worry about it more than once, I feel like is a problem in regards to the approach that was being taken here. Um, and then, of course, we get to, the big turning point, and the big question going in is going to be, are they going to make the big change that Hitchcock did or not? And they kind of, I mean, I don't know how much people want to hear what they know going in, but as far as, like, the book goes, that is the direction they go, where the book goes, but they still kind of tweak it a little bit. So that's that's the kind of thing that you can kind of get behind, where it's like you can kind of see it kind of trying to, in a way, do its own thing while also still doing the thing, sort of like the way we talked about, where Hitchcock changed this moment like entirely, and it's like it made Max two different characters between Hitchcock's movie and the book, and this one is kind of basically a middle ground, which is an interesting approach, but yeah, so there is that at least. And it does get to the point where after that, when we get into the stuff like the legalities of them finding the body and then the blackmail with Favell and all that, and Sam Riley is fine, and another Wheatley collaborator, but I don't really fault him, because filling George Sanders' shoes, especially in this part, was a daunting task anyway. So and he's fine. So I didn't have the really like relishing pleasure I did watching Sanders, but he's fine, I guess. But yeah, the story by itself is still so good that even though I wasn't really into it in kind of the first half, once we got back into this second section of the movie, when it goes into all that stuff, I still find myself getting sucked back into it the way I do watching Hitchcock's. And I feel like that's just more of a kind of says more about the material than the adaptation here. So yeah, and then we get another big change with the final scene, where it was like where I talked about, I liked that it went just a little past the book's ending and showed us just a little bit more after the fact, after the events of where the book ends. But just like a tiny step forward. But this wants to take that even further. And if you're concerned about, we were talking about how it gives more closure to like Mrs. Danvers and the direction that she went in the final moments of the story. And this one takes that for. So if you're all about wanting more kind of just closure to Mrs. Danvers, I guess I maybe this ending will be satisfying. I don't know, but I did feel like it kind of. There's only so many steps past the finish line you have to take just to kind of solidify what's going on and maybe give it a more, big and dramatic ending. But this wasn't really. This was probably a few steps past where we needed to go. So yeah, it didn't really add much to the character or how I look at the character or anything like that. So there it is. So I guess that's about it for this. So it could have been significantly worse, but for really it's probably just too bland to get too passionate about. So like I said, and there's some cases where, like I said, I could feel myself getting sucked in the way that I did watching Hitchcock's, but or reading the book. But it's really just here. Like I said, I don't even know who its audience is, or who's taking to it or who isn't. But it's here. It exists. So there's that. So I'm not quite sure what the next thing is going to be. It's going to be a bunch of verses all crammed in here together to get us to the end of the month. They were supposed to be more stretched out throughout the month, but too many delays kept happening and bullshit. But that's just what happens. So until whatever the next thing is, I think that's it for this.